Yeah, I was kept in a dungeon for a year, but the food was lit. What the f does that mean? And my blood did boil quite a bit. Hello, creeps. Andy here, and today I have for you the worst book ever written. I read it, and I have a lot to say. And so today I thought we would just have a little conversation about the worst book ever written. So let's start with the obvious. You know, obviously that's a subjective term. And in fact, if you Google the worst books ever written, there are a million lists, and there are often 3 of the same books on those lists. Not that this book isn't any of those, but one is Mein Kampf, one is Twilight, and the other is, oh, the Da Vinci Code. That one is for historical inaccuracies, if I'm not mistaken. And the others I'm not sure, because I've never read them or watched the movies. But anyways, this is not any of those, but I just thought I'd give you that tidbit of information because I thought it was pretty funny. This, however, is Irene Idleslay. This is written by Amanda McKittrick Ross, and boy oh boy, was it an interesting ride. So first, I'm gonna give you a little bit of backstory on this bad boy. This is all from Wikipedia, so you know, take with this information what you will, but it says Irene Idleslay is a romantic drama novel written by Amanda McKittrick Ross. Its publication in 1897 was financed by Ross's husband as a gift on their 10th wedding anniversary, which is kind of sweet. You know, his wife obviously had aspirations of being a writer, and so this working class man in the 1800s published it for his wife. That's very sweet. It says, it was widely considered one of the worst books of all time since its publication, and has been panned to critics for its excessive purple prose and poorly constructed plot. So if you don't know what purple prose is, it's essentially just the overuse of description, metaphors, adjectives, so much so that it convolutes the actual meaning of the story. However, I would argue that this book has purple patches in it where there's definitely purple prose within it, but the story itself is easy to read. But there are sections where you're like, what are you talking about? But, you know, not the whole thing is like that. Let me read you a few comments from critics, because Mark Twain basically said this book was trash. Mark Twain called it one of the greatest unintentionally humorous novels of all time. There's this literary group called Inklings. I mean, I'm assuming back then. It says that they turned the novel into a game to see who could read one of Ross's works, namely this one, for the longest without breaking out in laughter. Which is super messed up. I mean, these people just ripped this book apart, but I did write LOL a whole lot in my notes, so kind of understand what they're talking about. Then this Mark O'Connell said that Ross's prose amounts to a sort of accidental surrealism. There is an intention towards metaphor, a lunge in the general direction of literary, but an obvious misunderstanding of how such things work, and often, for that matter, how syntax works. Ross's writing is not just bad. In other words, its badness is so potent that it seems to undermine the very idea of literature. I mean, this is rough, right? And then we have this last comment here. This is by Don Howard from 1927, and he says, the book from the pen of an English workman's wife is rather a unique literary curiosity, which is its own value to the reader. We're definitely gonna have to talk about gender and how they're represented in this book. I mean, it's written in the 1800s and it's on every page. We're just gonna have to discuss it. So just keep that last comment in mind. So now, let's get to the story. I'm gonna give you a real quick synopsis before we begin, and then we're gonna dive in. I'm definitely gonna read you some of that purple prose that we've gotten here, and also just let you know how infuriating this book was for me. Okay, so Irene Idleslay, it's basically just about this woman who marries her husband and then things kind of fall apart. That's the whole basis of the story, but we're gonna go through and give you more information on that. But I'd like to read you the very first paragraph of the first chapter. Sympathize with me indeed. Ah, no, cast your sympathy on the chill waves of troubled waters. Fling it on the oasis of futurity, dash it against the rock of gossip, or better still, allow it to remain within the false and faithless bosom of buried scorn. Okay, so basically in this book we have 2 main characters. We have Irene Idleslay. She is an orphaned child Her parents both passed away, who was adopted by a rich couple in the area. Another guy who owns a castle is Sir John Dunford. And we learn that his mansion is gloomy, ivy-covered, and vast in proportion and magnificent in display. However, we get this line in here that says it's beautiful, yes, but it is not altogether free from mystery. Many of its rooms with the walls of crystal are gorgeously and profusely furnished. Others are locked incessantly against the foot of the cautious intruder. And that will come into the story a little bit more. I also wrote, oh yes, LOL on this page. Okay, so this is an example, I think, of that purple prose, or at least like an over descriptive sentence that just doesn't need to happen. It says, Sir John requested that his favorite apartment should be made bright as possible by adding more fuel to the smoldering ashes within the glistening bars which guarded their remains. This being done, 3 huge lamps were lighted and placed at respectable distances from each other when Sir John, with his accustomed grace, began to peruse some of his evening papers. I mean, that is a long-winded to say someone turned on a fucking lamp, you know? So there's just a lot of that in here. Another example, I won't read you a million of these, I promise, and bore you through the entire video, but I just have to drive home the point of how ridiculous some of these are. This is one sentence in this paragraph, okay? This whole paragraph is one sentence. It says, though a man of 40 years, he never yet had entertained the thought of yielding up his bacheloric ideas to supplant them with others which eventually should concede with those of a different sex. In fact, he never had bestowed a thought on changing his habits and manners of living, nor until fully realizing his position of birthright that had been treasured by his ancestors for such a lengthened period, and which sooner or later must pass into strangers' hand, did the thought ever occur to him of entering into the league of the blessed. Pretty ridiculous. I even wrote in my notes, I wrote, Henry James, is that you? So you guys know how I feel about Turn of the Screw. But I digress. So anyways, the Dilworths, who are Irene's adopted parents, they end up having a ball and invite Sir John. All the girls are dressed in their most expensive ball gowns, and they just want to, you know, get Sir John Dunford's attention because he's a rich bachelor, and everyone's like, that would be sick if I married him. Sir John doesn't really care about these women, but one maiden does draw his eye in. It says, there awaited his view another beam of light's brightest rays, beautiful Irene Iddlesley, an image of perfection and divine beauty. And it even goes on to say here, immediately before taking his departure, he pressed firmly her snowy hand and left the pretty gilded area which surrounded his first hopes of matrimony. So he basically sees her, he's like, ooh, she's really hot, I want to marry her. And it's crazy that the relationship didn't work out because it was based on 2 seconds of looking at someone. I know that this is like a sign of the times and stuff, and like, hey, you're rich, you have money, you're hot, let's get married kind of thing. But it's still crazy to read it, especially in this day and age. I also wanted to point out here too that this is kind of like that idealized love, like that Petrarch description of a woman basically on a pedestal, like she's so beautiful I can't look at her, you know, she's not even human, she floats when she walks, her skin's so pale I can see through it, like that shit, like that idealized love. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out really quick, that it is interesting that he kind of holds her on such a high pedestal. He's literally met her a few times. But anyway, so after meeting Irene Iddlesley, he realizes that his wealth and his possessions are great and everything, but like that said, you know, eventually he's gonna have to hand it down to someone, and he wants something that is the most precious treasure on earth. And he's talking about marriage, which at this point in the book, I felt like I liked Sir John. I thought he was fine. Irene, I didn't really have an opinion of either way. She seemed a little elusive to him, and we'll get to that in a minute. But for up until this point in the book, I thought, you know, cool. He knows what he wants. He's sick of being a bachelor. He wants a wife to share his life with, and that's cool, you know? Do your thing. So they get engaged. He ends up finding Irene with her tutor, and they're in a pretty intimate situation, and he gets pretty jealous of this. He also asks her if she wants to marry him, and she lies, and she's like, of course I do. The characters are so two-dimensional, it's very hard to figure out how they actually are feeling, and some things just surprise you and you're like, what's going on? And so at this point, we don't know if Irene's being forced into this marriage. I mean, it's the 1800s, but she doesn't really give indication other than her adopted parents are excited to see her marry Sir John Dunford. She knows that he has money and that she'll be taken care of. But other than that, she doesn't really give much indication that she's like so against this marriage or anything. And so yeah, it was just kind of confusing. I didn't really know what was happening. I didn't know if she was being forced into this marriage and that's why she was, you know, kind of like elusive to him, or what was going on. But her ideas on marriage are kind of interesting, to say the least. So she says these two things here. Great mercy, only 1 week and I shall almost cease to be a free thinker. Just 7 days and I shall be fettered with chains or dragging dislike with chains of dragging dislike and disappointment. Only 7 days and thus shall end my cherished hopes. So she is not happy about marrying him, but we don't really know why she goes through with it, you know? So yeah, that was kind of interesting to try to figure out. She does lie to him and mislead him. He acknowledges her odd moods and behaviors towards her, and she still says, like, no, I want to marry you. Let's be together. So they end up getting married. We also find that during this time, the Dilworths, her adopted parents, are actually poor. They go bankrupt, and after the couple is married, they end up being forced to sell their house. So that could also be a reason why she's forced into marriage, but I just wish the characters were more developed, and that way we really got the inside idea of what is actually going on and why this marriage is set up, because it doesn't read like it's an arranged marriage. So I don't know. So they get married, but the marriage isn't going so well. Once Irene ends up moving into Sir John's house, she kind of unleashes her wrath on everybody. It's true that she does blame him and she isn't honest with what's going on. During these 6 months that they were married, which should have been the pet period of nuptial harmony, it was proved the hideous period of howling dislike. Then Sir John, but the way that he approaches and asks her is so absurd. This is what he said. He's asking basically like, did she deceive him in marrying him? He says, was I duped to ascend the ladder of liberty, the hill of harmony, the truth of triumph and the rock of legend? And then wildly manifesting my act of ascension, was I to be informed of treating still in the valley of defeat? It's like, dude, relax. He asks, had the audacity to steal your desire for me and hide it beneath the pillaged pillow of poverty. What the fuck does that mean? Anyway, then he tells her, do not sit in silence and allow the blood that now boils in my veins to ooze through cavities of unrestrained passion and trickle down to drench me with its crimson hue. I mean, he's a little intense, right? She says, sir and husband, you have summoned me hither to lash your rebuke unmercifully upon me, unprovoked it may be. Okay, so she basically does gaslight him. Yeah, she's talking about her parents who passed away. These are her parents that she never met though. So yeah, she's just kind of gaslighting him and using excuses, you know, like, what are you talking about? No, I'm just sad because my parents died 20 years ago. The story continues by Irene giving birth to their child and shortly after becoming very ill. And in her feverish delirium, she confesses to Sir John that she's actually this entire time been in love with Oscar. Oscar Otwald, I believe his name is, the tutor, in which he saw her having kind of like an intimate moment with before they even got married. How could she? So he ends up going through her things and finding letters and trinkets and stuff from Oscar, realizes that it is true that she's not just delirious from her fever, and he is pissed. So what does an upset husband do when he finds out that the love of his life loves another? Does he divorce her, kick her out of the house? I mean, divorce probably wasn't a thing at the time. Kick her out of the house. You know, what does he do? No. None of that. He decides to lock her in a room. Now, back to that previous first page where it says there's some mystery about the house. Here is why. There's actually a room of death in the house. And the reason it is a room of death, this is the room of death. It defies escape or secretion. There was a lady who shared its mist with a born imbecile, the eldest daughter of my great-great-grandfather. So his older relative. It said that she lived there for 36 years, and though instantaneous insanity of her ward was marked a victim of his murderous hand, that during midnight, when she was fast asleep, he drew from that drawer a weapon of warlike design and severed her head almost from her body, causing instant death. I was like, Jesus, that took a turn. This page was my favorite for obvious reasons. But other than that, there's not really any spooky stuff going on in the story. It's just kind of thrown in there. So he goes to Irene. He tells her, I know that you're in love with Oscar. You told me about it when you were sick, blah, blah, blah. You, madam, have by your conduct, both before and after marriage, forced me to keep you a prisoner within these walls so long as you live or I exist. So he indefinitely locks her in this room. Now, she's still getting food and she's still living in a castle, but she's locked in a room. So much so that when she does finally escape, which we'll get to in a second, her legs are like atrophied and she can't walk because she's been in this room for a year. A year. She's not allowed to talk to anyone. She's not allowed to see anyone. She just gave birth to their son and is not allowed to see him. And again, this is where I wish more character development was in here because we don't know how she feels. She says nothing about her son, nothing through the entire book. So I don't know if she even cares that she's removed from her son or if she's just wants to leave and not be a prisoner. I don't know. The character development is so strange in this novel, and both characters are, yeah, they're just weird. But anyways, it is interesting because at this point, I feel like the pro and antagonist kind of switch, right? So whereas before I thought that Sir John was fine and I was kind of weary of Irene, they kind of switch places at this point. Like, Jesus, you're gonna lock her in a room for a year? That's pretty insane because she didn't do what you said. I don't know. Anyways, she ends up making her escape. She finds a way to contact her maid. It doesn't matter. It's a long thing. And her maid contacts Oscar, who still loves her. They still love each other, and they make their escape. Okay. But this is like little things like this where I'm like, is she just a bad person? I don't know. It's so hard to make sense of how these characters actually feel. So she makes her escape with Oscar. She loves him. She's with the guy she loves now, right? She should be happy. But Oscar is nothing but a poor tutor. He makes $1,000 a year. He also eventually sells his house for $1,000. Kind of crazy, but that's besides the point. She says, because they're kind of living in poverty now, she says she had recently fled from a dungeon, but it was not one of either starvation or poverty. Whilst occupying its darkened mist, she never had any cause for complaint regarding food or attendance, both of which could not possibly have been excelled. So she's basically saying, yeah, I was kept in a dungeon for a year, but the food was lit. I don't even know. But she ends up staying with Oscar, and so I really don't know. Like, you don't know her thought process. She obviously doesn't like living in poverty, and she's not accustomed to it. And she ends up having to even become part of the working class. But yeah, you really don't get much information on whether she's happier with a man that she loves in poverty or she was happier in a dungeon because she got food. You just don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. We have Sir John here. Go back to this douchebag. He's talking about himself and he says, until now, the forgiving husband, the meek advisor, the patient sufferer, the wounded knight, the once attached partner, the loving father, and the son of justice, gratitude, and chastity, was ready to share a little of his ransom with Irene, whom he thought he may have probably wronged by too rigorous punishment. He's revising his will, and so this is why he's thinking about this, but it's just funny that he's like, oh, but I was wronged, and yeah, maybe I shouldn't have locked her in a room for a year, but come on, I had the right to do it. It's just wild the way that he thinks of himself and how everyone thinks of him, really. To him who she deceived, deluded, denounced, and despised. And this is actually, I think, from her perspective, no? Yeah, that's her saying she deceived, deluded, denounced, and despised him. So that's kind of an interesting turn of events here. She's still with Oscar. They're, I believe, married at this point. So she's working. Her and Oscar get into a fight. I believe it comes physical. Honestly, I can't even remember. But anyways, she runs off and Oscar ends up drowning himself. He leaves a note for Irene. She gets the note from him after he drowns himself. Not from him, but from the cops or whatever. And this is what the note said. This is really the turning point in the book where I was like, what the fuck is happening? First he's like, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done all that crap, whatever. But he says, I implore of you, cast yourself at the feet of him being Sir John, and beg his forgiveness, who loved you with a love unspeakable, who served nearly all his self-indulgence with the instrument of intensity and hesitated not to lavish it upon your head, of whom I offer my last advice. He's telling her, yeah, I offed myself, but go back to Sir John and apologize for what you did, for loving me, your husband. This is just insanity. This is insanity. So she ends up doing it. Why? In order to obey the last instructions from the hand of Oscar Otwell. So it's not, I don't even think that she feels sorry for what she did. I mean, I don't know. I actually don't know. I couldn't tell you what she thinks because things are just so convoluted in here that it's really hard to follow her perspective. The plot is easy to follow, but as far as the characters, decisions, and what they do, I'm just very confused on what's going on. She ends up going back to Sir John, but there's a problem, my friends. Sir John is ill. He is on his deathbed, and up until this point, he has told his son that his mom has been dead. But because he's on his deathbed, he's like, I should probably explain who your mom is. So he does this. He's a douche. He says for years had kept him prisoner of her influence. Like, he really does not think he's in the wrong at all. Anyways, so he tells his son who his mom really is, explains what happened, that she was in love with Oscar, and he says, I was therefore obliged through her male practices to shut her in from the gaze of outsiders. And then this man has the audacity to tell his son, yeah, she was in there for a year, but then during Christmas this one year, when I fully resolved to free her. No, you didn't. You had no, there's not one shred of doubt in my mind that he was going to not, wait, what am I trying to say? He was gonna keep her locked up. He's such a liar. I don't like him. I don't like him at all. It's so ridiculous. So anyways, he's on his deathbed. He tells his child that one day he may meet her, but my child, for my sake, avoid her cunning ways and works, and never allow her shelter underneath this roof, she dishonored and despised. So the son says, okay. Sir John Dunford succumbs to his whatever was wrong with him. I don't know. He died. She ends up returning. I believe she's in America, but she ends up coming back to England or whatever the fuck they are. I don't know. She goes to apologize to Sir John. I don't know. I don't think because she means it, but because her husband who died told her to. Anyways, she ends up finding out that Sir John is dead and that she comes face to face with her son, and he gives an entire soliloquy. I mean, just rips into this woman, but basically he says false woman, wicked wife, detested mother, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. He's like, leave, don't ever talk to me again, you're a loser. So then she goes to the house that her and Oscar lived in before they fled. They had to run away because of Sir John. Oscar ended up selling the house to Irene Idleslay's real uncle, like her biological uncle, and he was trying to find his biological niece. He had found out that she had been adopted in the area, so he purposefully came to this area, bought a house to try to find her. She knew this, and instead of saying anything, she just fled. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, some of the stuff that she does, like, she does seem very selfish, but then at the same time, I guess I understand because you're running from your husband and nobody can know, but if he's your uncle and he really cared, I don't know. Anyways, this part is wild. So there's a man who answers the door and he's the caretaker of the property. She asks if her uncle still lives there. She doesn't say who she is, but she says, does that guy still live there? He says, no, I'm the caretaker. He died a fucking decade ago. And she says, you are rather lonely. And he replies, yes, yes, but I have always been accustomed living alone, being an old bachelor and wish to remain so. It is better to live a life of singleness than torture both body and soul by marrying a woman who doesn't love you, like the good Sir John Dunford. Forget the dungeon that he locked his wife in. I can't get with this. So then Irene, instead of being upset that her biological uncle is dead, just says, well, what about his will? Did he leave anything to anyone? I mean, she kind of does suck too. They both suck. They deserve each other, honestly. And I think all that we have left is the moral of the story, which is this. She who might have swayed society's circle, she who might have shared in the greatness of her position and defied the crooked stream of poverty in which she so long sailed, had she only been, first of all, true to herself, and then the honorable name of Sir John Dunford. So basically, because she was horrible to her husband, she deserved all the horrible things that she got. I mean, it's just wild. And then let me read you just this last sentence here. and then I'll give you kind of my final thoughts and we'll wrap up. This is from her son's perspective. It's the last line of the book. He says that he blotted her name forever from the book of his memory, and being strongly prejudiced by a father of faultless bearing, resolved that the shares of beauty, youth, and false love should never have the slightest catch on his affections. So basically, he will not follow in the footsteps of his father and be deceived by a woman as awful as Irene Iddlesley. Absolutely wild read. It's really interesting because I remember in college us talking about, I can't remember what it was or what we were specifically reading, but we were talking about how women are portrayed in literature, even through women who are the writers. I mean, this whole book is just about punishing a woman because she's not doing what her husband married her for, you know? And not to say that she's not at fault and she's not a shitty person, because I think that's proved throughout the story too, but it is just kind of crazy how everyone sides with the husband. Obviously, also you could argue that it's a comment on poverty versus people who have money, you know, that people side with the people who have money and their power and their reach and all that stuff too. But there definitely are interesting comments in here that women are the weaker sex. This is written by a woman, by the way. There's also this comment who says, this is from Irene, she's saying this. She said, she pondered whether or not honesty should take the place of deceit, too often practiced in women. And then we have Sir John's comments on women. He says that he abandoned every unkind thought harbored in his mind against women, and that he had at last thrown aside the garb of female dislike. I mean, just kind of interesting to read a book from the 1800s and, you know, read about a woman writing about how awful women are. There are one or two lines that I actually did like in this story. I mean, I know this is like 200 pages and there's 2 lines, but I thought I'd read those to you and not leave it off on a horrible note. But it says, those were joined 2 hearts of wildly different beat. One of intense love, which hearsay never could shake, the other of dire dislike, which reason could never alter. I really enjoyed that quote. And then also we have this quote over here. He became resolved to probe the wound that had swollen so enormously as to demand immediate relief. I like that too. But then there are silly lines like we read, actually I don't know if I read this one, but oh yeah, no I did. A man of 40 summers, it's just kind of funny. And she also says at one point, having quietly crept out of boyhood for a lengthened period. Like, just say he's old, like what do you, I don't know. Altogether, I mean, my thoughts on this, it was just kind of infuriating. I mean, whatever way you look at it, if you read it from the perspective of a man versus woman, or if you read it from the perspective of poor versus rich, it's still just, I feel like, an unfair, one-sided, ridiculous moral of a story. And that's Irene Iddlesley. So yeah, I guess my dislike of this book isn't necessarily the purple prose or the over description or the inappropriate use of syntax, you know. It was more the story itself and how infuriating it was. So let me know what you guys think of this one. Let me know if you guys will read Irene Iddlesley, obviously a classic novel that everyone should read. Was it the worst book ever written? I mean, that's obviously for the interpretation of the reader. It was not one that I enjoyed, I can tell you that much. But it was fun for the LOLs, you know? I did get a few laughs here and there, and my blood did boil quite a bit. So there you have it. Irene Iddlesley. Amanda McKittriss-Ross just kind of sucks a little bit. Anyways, thanks for watching. I know this video was kind of an interesting one, maybe different from the horror that I usually discuss, but I thought it might be interesting to some of you. So let me know what you think, and thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another horror video. Bye guys.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.